The cabin had always been more than just wood and nails to him. Hidden deep in the pine woods, about 2 hours outside the city, it stood as a silent monument to decades of service and sacrifice. For Major General Robert Harlow, recently retired after 40 years in the Army, the cabin represented peace. It was not extravagant, just a modest log structure on a stretch of land he had purchased long ago when he was still a captain. Over the years, he had restored it board by board, making it both functional and comforting. It had been months since he had last visited. Life after retirement had been filled with ceremonies, interviews, and constant requests for appearances. Finally, though, he longed for quiet. The cabin was the perfect place for that, an escape from the noise, a retreat into the whispering woods where only the wind and the birds held conversations. On a crisp Saturday morning, Robert loaded his truck with supplies, a few personal belongings, and his loyal dog Max. The drive out was uneventful, the kind of journey he enjoyed. By late afternoon, the gravel path to the cabin crunched under his tires, and the structure appeared between the trees. It was as he remembered it, sturdy, dignified, a little weathered, but unbowed by time. What he did not know was that the world around the cabin had changed since his last visit. A sprawling suburban development had cropped up along the main road, full of new houses with picket fences, trimmed lawns, and people who fancied themselves rulers of their little slice of paradise. They had formed a strict homeowners association, and at the head of it sat Karen Whitmore. Known for her sharp tongue, relentless complaints, and obsession with enforcing rules that stretched far beyond the HOA actual boundaries, Karen had quickly become infamous in the neighborhood. The cabin was not under the HOA jurisdiction. It predated the neighborhood by decades, but Karen believed that anything within eyeshot of her development should fall under her watchful eye. When she first spotted the cabin from the cul-de-sac nearest to the woods, she had declared it an eyesore. Insisting that it would bring down property values, she had convinced herself that whoever used it was some sort of squatter or criminal. So, when Robert returned to his cabin that weekend, Karen's self-appointed patrols noticed. More specifically, her teenage son, Trevor, did. Riding his bike through the edges of the woods, he caught sight of Robert unloading firewood and supplies. Instead of minding his own business, Trevor hurried home to tell his mother. Karen's reaction was immediate. To her, this was a trespasser. A suspicious old man had moved into her woods, and she would not tolerate it. Without even attempting to learn the truth, she picked up her phone and dialed 911, demanding that the police send someone right away. Robert, inside the cabin, had no idea of the storm brewing nearby. He had lit a small fire in the hearth, opened a tin of beans, and settled into a chair with Max at his feet. The quiet was a welcome change from the constant demands of city life. He was unaware that headlights would soon cut through the darkening woods and bring with them not peace, but confrontation. When the police cruiser arrived, Karen was not far behind, marching with the righteous fury of someone who believed the entire neighborhood owed her compliance. She pointed toward the cabin, insisting that the man inside was a trespasser. The officer, weary from too many false calls in the community, approached cautiously. Inside, Robert heard the tires on gravel and the crunch of boots outside. Decades of military training meant his instincts remained sharp. He opened the door calmly, Max by his side, and greeted the sight of the officer with the quiet composure of someone who had faced far greater threats than this. The officer began to ask questions, but then his eyes fell on the framed certificate visible through the open door, the Distinguished Service Medal hanging on the cabin wall. His gaze flicked back to Robert, and recognition dawned. The lines of respect straightened his posture instantly. This was not just an ordinary man in a cabin. This was Major General Harlow. With crisp authority, the officer saluted, startling Karen, who stood behind him, arms folded and ready to gloat. The words that followed would silence her for the first time in years. "Respect, Major General." Karen's jaw dropped. She had expected the officer to drag Robert out, to fine him, to make him disappear from her precious neighborhood's view. Instead, she watched as the man she had accused of trespassing was honored. For Robert, the irony was not lost. Here he was, in the woods he had legally owned for decades, confronted by a woman who believed she controlled everything in sight. He gave a nod, calm but firm, while the officer turned to Karen. His tone shifted from respectful to sharp as he questioned her reasons for calling 911 on a decorated war veteran in his own home. Karen sputtered excuses, but none of them carried weight. The officer warned her against making false emergency calls, reminding her that the law did not bend to her personal whims. Her face flushed red, but she refused to back down. In her mind, she was never wrong. As the officer returned to his car, Robert closed the cabin door, finally realizing that his peaceful retreat might not be as quiet as he had hoped. Max growled low, sensing his unease. And outside, in the shadows of the pine trees, Karen stood with narrowed eyes, her determination hardening. She had been humiliated, yes, but she was not finished. In fact, she was just beginning. The weekend at the cabin, which had started with the promise of peace, had now turned into the opening volley of a battle Robert did not ask for, but one that was surely coming his way. The woods grew silent again, but beneath that silence a storm was forming. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the cabin's windows, but the peace that Robert had hoped for felt thinner than usual. He brewed a pot of coffee on the wood, burning stove, the familiar aroma filling the room. But in the back of his mind, the events of last night lingered. He had faced Karen, a self-proclaimed guardian of property values, and while the police officer had put her in her place, Robert knew that people like her rarely surrendered quietly. Max, ever alert, paced near the door, his ears pricking at every sound from outside. The woods were alive with the rustling of squirrels, the chatter of birds, and the occasional crunch of footsteps on fallen pine needles. Robert stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, and saw no one. Yet, the sense of being watched was unmistakable. Karen was already at work. Humiliation burned in her memory from the night before, when the officer had shown respect to Robert instead of hauling him away. She had stormed home with her son, vowing that no military medals or cabin deeds would stop her from protecting her neighborhood. In her mind, she saw herself as a crusader for justice, a protector against intruders who threatened her perfect suburban bubble. By mid-morning, Karen began her campaign. Armed with her smartphone, she posted on the neighborhood Facebook group, spreading exaggerated claims about a dangerous squatter living in a cabin near the development. She omitted the part where the officer had called him Major General, of course, choosing instead to paint him as a stubborn outsider who refused to leave. She insisted that his presence was lowering property values and posed a security risk to families. Her words, written with venom, rippled through the digital echo chamber. Neighbors chimed in, some agreeing with her, others skeptical. A few dared to ask whether the man had legal rights to the property, but Karen dismissed them with curt replies. Her tone was clear. Anyone not on her side was against her. Meanwhile, Robert went about his day. He stacked firewood, cleared brush around the cabin, and took Max on long walks through the forest paths he had known for decades. The cabin was more than a retreat. It was part of his history. He remembered weekends spent here during his younger years, the solitude it offered before deployments, the letters he had written at its desk to family and friends across the world. It was sacred to him, a reminder of simpler times, yet the quiet did not last. That afternoon, as Robert was repairing a section of the fence line, he noticed movement near the tree line. Karen's son, Trevor, stood with a group of neighborhood kids, pointing and laughing. They shouted things like squatter and hobo, their voices carrying just enough for Robert to hear. He ignored them at first, unwilling to engage with children who clearly echoed their mother's bitterness. But Max barked, sending the kids scattering back toward the subdivision. Robert shook his head. This was no longer just a matter of peace and quiet. It was clear that Karen intended to escalate. Indeed, she did. By evening, Karen organized what she dramatically referred to as a neighborhood safety meeting. In her spacious living room, surrounded by eager listeners, she presented herself as a victim of an unfair system that allowed a stranger to camp out near their homes. She spoke of potential dangers, sprinkling in baseless suggestions that Robert's presence could attract crime or threaten children. Her audience, stirred by fear and her relentless charisma, agreed that something had to be done. But Karen went further. She proposed forming a committee to deal with the cabin problem. She assigned roles, handed out clipboards, and instructed her followers to document every sighting of Robert, every noise from the woods, every imagined disturbance. In her mind, this was no longer about one man in a cabin. It was a crusade for control, a test of her authority. Back at the cabin, Robert sat by the fire, unaware of the full extent of Karen's schemes. He reflected on his long career, the places he had served, the conflicts he had seen. Compared to the deserts and battlefields of his past, one stubborn neighbor hardly seemed a threat. Yet he also knew the power of persistence. He had seen how relentless opposition, even from small forces, could wear down the strongest defenses. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from an old friend, a fellow officer who had heard rumors circulating online. Someone had screenshotted Karen's Facebook post, and it was spreading beyond the neighborhood group. Veterans forums had picked it up, outraged that a decorated major general was being smeared as a squatter. Messages of support poured in from people Robert had never met, strangers who respected his service and his right to peace. Robert leaned back in his chair, feeling a shift in the winds. He had never sought recognition or conflict outside of duty, but it seemed both had found him once again. If Karen wanted a battle, she might find herself outmatched. Still, Karen pressed on. The next morning, she and her committee marched to the edge of the woods, clipboards in hand like self-appointed inspectors. They took photos of the cabin from afar, scribbled notes about suspicious activity, and whispered conspiratorially among themselves. Karen, at the front of the group, strutted with the confidence of someone who believed victory was inevitable. But as she raised her phone to snap yet another picture, she noticed movement on the porch. Robert stepped out, standing tall, his presence commanding even in casual clothes. Max stood beside him, tail rigid, eyes fixed on the intruders. Karen hesitated, her fingers tightening around her phone, but she refused to back down. Robert said nothing, his silence heavier than words. His gaze alone was enough to scatter some of the committee members who mumbled excuses and slipped back toward the subdivision. But Karen remained, her jaw set, her eyes burning with determination. She snapped one last photo before turning on her heel and marching away. In her mind, this was evidence, proof she could use to escalate her campaign. That night, she drafted letters to the county zoning board, the sheriff's office, and even the local news. She claimed the cabin was unsafe, that Robert was living there illegally, and that the community demanded action. Robert, meanwhile, sat at his desk penning a letter of his own, not one of complaint but of calm resolve. He knew the land was his, the cabin his, and the law on his side. Yet something told him this would not be resolved by legalities alone. Karen was not seeking truth, she was seeking dominance. The battle lines were drawn. The cabin, once a place of peace, had become a front line, and though Robert had not chosen the fight, he would not retreat. Not now, not ever. As the fire crackled and shadows danced along the wooden walls, Robert prepared himself for what was to come. And outside, in the neat, sterile streets of the subdivision, Karen prepared as well. For her, this was no longer about property values. It was personal. The storm had begun. By the time Monday morning arrived, Karen had already executed the next phase of her plan. She was a master of gossip, and in her hands a whisper became a wildfire. While most of her neighbors were heading off to work, Karen sat at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee and her laptop open. The Facebook group was buzzing again. Overnight, she had posted a long, impassioned message painting Robert as a dangerous, unstable man squatting in their woods. She claimed he had been aggressive, that his dog had chased children, and that the cabin was falling apart and attracting vermin. Every word was a lie, but lies spread faster than truth when packaged with fear. Karen knew this, she thrived on it. Her neighbors, many of them too busy to investigate for themselves, clicked like and share, passing her version of the story along until it reached inboxes and group chats far beyond the subdivision. Robert, meanwhile, had no idea how far Karen's smear campaign had reached. He was splitting logs in the yard, the steady rhythm of axe and wood filling the cool morning air. Max lay nearby, chewing on a stick, unconcerned with the growing storm on the other side of the trees. For Robert, the routine was grounding. After decades of high command, where every decision could mean life or death, the simplicity of firewood was a welcome relief. But his phone buzzed again. Another message from an old comrade. Then another. The texts all carried the same theme: "You're going viral." Screenshots of Karen's posts arrived one after another, each more inflammatory than the last. One friend even called to tell him that a local news outlet had picked up the story, running it under the headline "Neighborhood at Odds Over Mysterious Cabin Dweller." Robert sat down heavily on the porch steps, the phone in his hand. He scrolled through the posts, shaking his head. He had faced enemy propaganda in foreign lands, but it was something else entirely to see his own neighbor spin fiction against him. What struck him most wasn't anger, it was disappointment. After giving everything to his country, he had hoped for peace and retirement. Instead, he had become a target once again. Karen, however, was delighted. She paraded around the subdivision, relishing the attention. She bragged about being quoted in the article, portraying herself as the lone protector of the community. Her son, Trevor, followed behind her like a shadow, soaking up her self-righteousness. Together, they strutted past the rows of houses, collecting nods from neighbors who either believed her lies or simply wanted to avoid her wrath. That afternoon, Karen decided to escalate further. She called the zoning board, filing a complaint that the cabin was an illegal structure. She called the health department, claiming it was a safety hazard. She even called animal control, insisting that Robert's dog was dangerous. Each call was laced with exaggeration, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. But bureaucracy moves slowly, and Robert's paperwork was in perfect order. He had owned the land for decades, paid taxes on it faithfully, and kept the cabin maintained. Karen's complaints raised eyebrows, but none of them stuck. Still, the damage was done. Rumors spread. Parents in the subdivision warned their children not to go near the woods. Joggers avoided the path that passed by the cabin. The sense of isolation that Robert had once cherished now carried a weight of suspicion. He could feel the eyes of the neighborhood pressing on him, even from miles away. That night, as Robert sat by the fire with Max at his feet, he heard the crunch of footsteps outside. He rose quietly and opened the door to see the faint glow of flashlights moving between the trees. He recognized the voices, Karen and her so-called committee, trespassing onto his land again. They whispered and giggled as they snapped more photos of the cabin. Robert stepped out onto the porch. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His tall frame, his steady presence, and Max's low growl were enough to freeze them in place. One by one, they backed away, muttering excuses. But Karen lingered longer, glaring at him through the shadows. In her mind, this was war, and in war she never backed down. The following day, Robert decided to take a different approach. He drove into town, stopping by the sheriff's office. He calmly explained the situation, providing his deed and identification. The sheriff, already aware of Karen's history of frivolous complaints, listened carefully. He promised Robert that the law was on his side, but also warned him that Karen was unlikely to stop. "She thrives on conflict," the sheriff said. "She'll keep pushing until she feels like she's won." Robert nodded. He had dealt with worse adversaries than Karen, but he also understood that small battles could become relentless wars of attrition. If she wanted to wear him down, she would have to learn that his endurance was unmatched. Meanwhile, the veteran community online had rallied. Veterans groups began sharing Karen's posts, pointing out the disrespect being shown to a decorated major general. Comments flooded in from people who had never met Robert but felt compelled to defend him. Stories of his service surfaced, written by soldiers who had served under him. To them, he wasn't just a man in a cabin. He was a leader who had guided them through their darkest days. By Wednesday, the narrative was shifting. Karen still screamed her version into the void, but the tide of public opinion was no longer in her favor. Some of her neighbors, once loyal to her, began to question her motives. Why was she targeting a man who had done nothing wrong? Why was she dragging the entire community into a feud? The pressure only made Karen more erratic. She doubled her patrols, stalking the edges of the woods at night. She harassed delivery drivers who dared bring packages to Robert's cabin. She even cornered the mailman, demanding to know what kind of correspondence Robert received. Robert observed all of this with quiet patience. He refused to lash out or meet her anger with his own. Instead, he stood tall, kept his routines, and documented everything. If Karen wanted a war, she would discover that he had fought bigger wars, and won. The smear campaign had been her first strike, a battle of words and whispers, but Robert knew it wouldn't stop there. Karen had tasted humiliation once before, and she would not let it happen again. The fire crackled in the cabin that night, the shadows long and deep. Max lay alert by the door, ears twitching at every sound. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, because the war for peace had only just begun. Karen had tasted frustration, and frustration only sharpened her determination. Her smear campaign had not gone as planned. Instead of rallying universal support, it had backfired. Some neighbors had quietly distanced themselves, embarrassed by how far she had taken things. The online backlash was even worse. Complete strangers were criticizing her, questioning her judgment, and mocking her obsession with the cabin. But Karen was not the kind of person to reflect and retreat. In her mind, every setback was just another reason to push harder. By Thursday morning, she had decided that if gossip and intimidation would not work, she would turn to the law. After all, Karen loved rules, especially when she could twist them to suit her purposes. She called the county offices one after another, asking about zoning codes, building permits, septic systems, and anything else she could use as ammunition. She filed official complaints, claiming the cabin was unsafe, that Robert was living there illegally, and that the land should be condemned. Her calls reached the desk of a weary clerk who had dealt with her before. Karen's name was well known in the office, and not in a flattering way. Still, protocol required them to log her complaints. An inspector was scheduled to visit the property. To Karen, this was victory. In her mind, the government was finally taking her side. Back at the cabin, Robert received the notice with calm composure. He had expected this. Karen's tactics were predictable. Relentless, yes, but predictable. He gathered the paperwork he had kept for decades, the original deed, the building permits from the renovations, the tax receipts. Every document was in perfect order, neatly filed in a folder he kept in the cabin's desk. When the inspector arrived that afternoon, Robert greeted him with quiet courtesy. Max wagged his tail as the man walked the perimeter, clipboard in hand. The inspector checked the foundation, the septic tank, the electrical system, all of it. He asked questions, and Robert answered with precision, presenting documents whenever needed. Within an hour, the inspection was complete. The inspector shook Robert's hand and left, impressed not only by the cabin's condition, but also by Robert's preparedness. For Karen, this would be another blow, though she did not know it yet. That evening, Robert received a different kind of visitor. A black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway, and out stepped a man in uniform. Colonel James Whittaker, one of Robert's former subordinates. Word of Karen's campaign had spread far beyond the county, and veterans across the state were rallying. The colonel had driven hours just to check on his old commander. Robert welcomed him inside, and though no words were spoken about strategy, both men understood. This was no longer just a nuisance neighbor problem. It had become a matter of principle. Meanwhile, Karen was busy drafting her latest masterpiece, a petition. She typed furiously, demanding that the county take action against the cabin. She circulated it through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, pressuring people to sign. Some neighbors scribbled their names just to make her go away. Others refused, citing the respect they held for Robert once they learned who he was. But Karen ignored the refusals and clung to the signatures she collected. waving them like a banner of victory. On Friday morning, she marched to the county offices again, petition in hand. She slammed it onto the counter, demanding immediate action. The clerk, tired of her antics, explained once more that Robert's ownership was legitimate, his permits valid, and his cabin perfectly legal. Karen's face reddened, her voice rising as she accused the office of corruption, favoritism, and neglect. She stormed out, convinced that everyone was against her. Back in the subdivision, Karen gathered her committee. She told them the county was useless, that they would have to handle the situation themselves. Her words dripped with venom as she painted Robert as an enemy who threatened everything they had worked for. She proposed escalating their tactics. Louder protests at the cabin, harassment through constant noise, and even blocking the gravel road with their cars. But cracks were forming in her following. Some committee members shifted uncomfortably, muttering that maybe this had gone too far. They had joined to support the neighborhood, not to wage a personal vendetta against a veteran who had done nothing wrong. Karen silenced their doubts with glares, insisting that unity was the only way forward. Still, unease simmered beneath the surface. Robert, however, remained unshaken. He continued his routine, chopping wood, walking Max, maintaining the cabin. He made a few discreet calls, reaching out to local officials and old contacts. Quietly, he ensured that his bases were covered. If Karen wanted to play legal games, she would soon discover that he was always 10 steps ahead. Saturday morning brought another twist. Karen's son Trevor, restless and eager to impress his mother, sneaked into the woods with a couple of friends. Armed with spray paint, they scrawled graffiti on Robert's fence, writing insults and mocking slogans. They thought it was harmless fun, a way to rile up the squatter. But Robert's motion-activated cameras caught everything. Every word, every laugh, every stroke of paint was recorded. By noon, Robert had already turned the footage over to the sheriff. Charges were filed, and Trevor found himself facing consequences his mother could not easily brush aside. When Karen learned of this, she exploded. Her screams echoed through the neighborhood as she blamed Robert, the sheriff, and even her son's friends. But deep down, she knew she was losing control. Her campaign was unraveling. That night, she sat in her living room, stewing. The petition had failed, the inspector had cleared the cabin, and now her son was in trouble. Yet, instead of admitting defeat, Karen's mind twisted the narrative further. In her eyes, Robert wasn't just a stubborn old man. He was an adversary, a manipulator, a villain, and she would not rest until she had destroyed him. At the cabin, Robert stood on the porch, watching the stars. Max rested at his feet, calm after a long day. The night was quiet, but Robert knew it was only a fragile pause. Karen had proven herself relentless, and relentless opponents were dangerous. The legal trap she had tried to spring on him had failed. But he knew she would come back with something else, something louder, something riskier. The storm was far from over. By Sunday morning, the subdivision was buzzing with tension. The previous week had turned quiet streets into a battleground of whispers, stares, and uneasy conversations. Neighbors who had once marched behind Karen with clipboards now avoided her eye. Parents grumbled about Trevor's graffiti stunt, and some openly questioned whether Karen had gone too far. But for Karen, doubt only hardened resolve. In her mind, the world was conspiring against her, and the only way forward was to escalate. She hatched a plan that morning as she sipped her coffee, scrolling furiously through her phone. If the county wouldn't remove Robert, and if her neighbors were too weak to stand with her, she would create a spectacle. She would confront him directly, drag the issue into the open, and expose him as the villain she believed him to be. By midday, Karen had rallied a small group of die-hard supporters, the last remnants of her committee. With poster boards scribbled in bold letters, they gathered at the edge of the gravel road leading to the cabin. Words like "protect our neighborhood" and "no trespassers allowed" glared in red paint. They marched with Karen at the front, her voice sharp as she shouted slogans into the trees. Robert heard them long before he saw them. The chants drifted through the woods, carried on the wind, breaking the fragile peace of the afternoon. He set down the log he was splitting and wiped the sweat from his brow. Max growled softly, ears twitching, sensing the disturbance. Robert walked to the porch and waited. The group emerged from the tree line like a parade of misplaced zealots, signs raised, voices loud, faces tight with conviction. Karen stood in the middle, her chin high, her eyes blazing. She pointed toward the cabin as if presenting evidence to an invisible jury. For a moment, Robert simply stood, his posture calm but unyielding. He let them shout, let them wave their signs, let them feel the weight of their performance. Then, as silence briefly fell between chants, he stepped forward. His presence alone silenced half the group. The way he carried himself, steady and authoritative, commanded respect without a word. Karen, however, did not falter. She launched into a tirade, her voice rising over the hush. She accused him of squatting, of endangering children, of lowering property values. She gestured wildly at the cabin, at Max, at the trees. Her words tumbled over each other, frantic and venomous. But Robert did not respond. He did not argue, did not defend himself. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Calmly, deliberately, he held it open so the crowd could see. The documents gleamed in the sunlight, deeds, permits, proof of ownership, all stamped and sealed. He turned the folder slightly, ensuring every set of eyes caught the truth. A murmur rippled through the group. Some lowered their signs, exchanging uneasy glances. Karen's voice wavered, then cracked, but she pushed on, shouting louder to drown out the doubt. At that moment, another sound cut through the chaos, the crunch of tires on gravel. A convoy of vehicles appeared, led by the same police officer who had come that first night. Behind him came a news van, its camera already rolling, and a handful of cars belonging to veterans who had driven in to support Robert. The officer stepped out, his posture straight, his eyes sharp. He looked at Robert, then at Karen's group, then back to Robert again. With crisp precision, he saluted. The words that followed echoed with authority and finality. "Respect, Major General." The veterans behind him followed suit, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, but all standing tall. Their presence was undeniable. They had not come for confrontation. They had come for respect, for solidarity, for truth. Karen's face drained of color. The cameras captured every second, her shouting, her signs, her accusations, all juxtaposed against the quiet dignity of Robert and the solemn respect of the veterans. The image was damning. Neighbors who had been skeptical now saw the truth with their own eyes. Karen was not protecting the community. She was waging a personal vendetta, and she had chosen the wrong man to target. The officer turned to Karen, his tone clipped and firm. He reminded her of the false reports she had filed, the wasted resources, the harassment. He warned her that continued behavior could result in charges of her own. Karen stammered, sputtered, trying to twist the narrative, but her words fell flat. The crowd was no longer listening. The news camera lingered on Robert as he stood silently, Max at his side, the folder still open in his hand. The story had written itself. A decorated major general, retired and seeking peace, harassed by an overzealous neighbor. The footage would spread quickly, and Karen knew it. Her committee dissolved before her eyes. One by one, her supporters lowered their signs and drifted away, unwilling to be part of the spectacle any longer. Trevor, embarrassed and restless, muttered something about going home. Even the most loyal of her allies had reached their limit. Karen stood alone, her fists clenched, her breath sharp and ragged. She glared at Robert, her eyes burning with a mix of fury and humiliation. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed back toward the subdivision, her pride shattered but her anger unresolved. The veterans approached Robert, offering firm handshakes and quiet words of encouragement. The officer lingered for a moment, promising to keep an eye on things, then returned to his cruiser. The news crew packed up, eager to air their footage. As the last car disappeared down the gravel road, the woods fell silent again. Robert returned to the porch, Max trotting beside him. He placed the folder back on the desk inside, then sank into his chair. The fire crackled, the evening shadows stretched long, and for the first time in days he felt a flicker of peace. But he knew it would not last. Karen had been humiliated, and humiliation was a dangerous fuel. She had lost the crowd, lost the narrative, lost the moment. Yet Robert understood the stubbornness of people like her. She would not give up. She would regroup, reframe, and return. The confrontation had ended, but the war was not over. The final act was still to come. Karen returned home from the confrontation like a storm cloud rolling into the subdivision. Her face was twisted with rage, her hands trembling, her pride in tatters. Neighbors peeked through blinds as she stomped up her driveway, her son trailing behind with his head down. The shouting, the signs, the news cameras, it had all backfired spectacularly. Within hours, the video hit local television. By the next morning, it was online, circulating on social media, passed from one screen to the next. Clips of Karen screaming accusations played side by side with footage of the officers saluting Robert. The words "respect," "Major General," etched into the narrative. The comments sections were merciless. Karen was branded as a bully, a Karen, in every sense of the word, while Robert became a symbol of quiet dignity under fire. The subdivision, once her kingdom, shifted against her. Neighbors whispered in grocery store aisles, rolled their eyes as she passed, and declined to answer her knocks at their doors. The Facebook group, once her stage, filled with posts criticizing her behavior. Some members even called for her removal from the HOA board, citing the embarrassment she had caused. But Karen refused to surrender. Instead, her behavior spiraled. She launched into rants at HOA meetings, screaming about conspiracies and favoritism. She accused the county, the sheriff, and even the veterans of colluding against her. Each outburst only further isolated her. Where once her voice carried authority, now it was met with sighs, eye rolls, and eventual silence. Meanwhile, Robert remained steady. He did not engage, did not gloat, did not fuel the flames. He kept to his cabin, tending to the land, walking Max, and enjoying the quiet he had fought so hard to protect. Letters continued to arrive from strangers, notes of gratitude, of respect, of solidarity. Some were from soldiers who had served under him, others from ordinary people moved by the story. For Robert, it was never about attention. It was about principle, about standing firm against unfairness. As weeks passed, Karen's grip on her imagined power crumbled. The HOA board, tired of her antics, voted to censure her. Neighbors who had once followed her stopped attending her meetings or answering her texts. Even Trevor grew distant, embarrassed by the constant ridicule at school, tired of being dragged into his mother's crusade. The once proud queen of the cul-de-sac had become a pariah. One evening, Robert sat on his porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. The woods were alive with the sound of crickets, the air cool and crisp. He sipped his coffee, Max curled at his feet, and for the first time in months, the silence felt whole again. But even in peace, he reflected on the battle. Karen had not been his greatest adversary, far from it, but she had been relentless, a reminder that conflict does not always come from distant enemies. Sometimes it comes from next door, wearing a friendly smile turned sour. He had faced her with patience, with proof, with dignity. And in the end, it was not rage that defeated her, but truth. Across the subdivision, Karen sat alone in her living room, the blinds drawn, the glow of her phone screen illuminating her face. She scrolled through comments, each one a reminder of her humiliation. Her friends had abandoned her, her reputation was ruined, and her authority shattered. Still, she muttered to herself, clinging to the idea that she had been right all along. But no one listened anymore. Her voice, once amplified by fear, now echoed only in her own head. The sheriff's office eventually issued a formal warning to her. Any further harassment of Robert would result in charges. The county dismissed her complaints, citing the repeated waste of resources. Even the HOA board, once her stage, stripped her of leadership. Her kingdom was gone. Robert, however, never sought revenge. He did not press charges, did not sue, did not demand restitution. That was not his way. He simply wanted peace, and peace was what he finally received. The cabin, sturdy and silent, stood as it always had, untouched by her tantrums, unmoved by her accusations. As the first snow of winter fell over the pines, Robert sat by the fire, Max asleep at his side. The flames crackled, the shadows danced, and the weight of the past months lifted. The cabin had weathered storms before, and it would weather them again. For him, it was more than a home. It was a sanctuary, a place where dignity stood taller than noise, where truth outlasted lies. And though Karen still lingered in the neighborhood, her power was gone, her voice diminished, her crusade defeated. The war she had waged had ended not with victory, but with her own collapse. For Robert it was simple. He had stood his ground, he had lived with honor, and now at last he had his peace. The woods were quiet again. This time the quiet would last.